Hi guys, thank you all for tuning in and welcome back to Sewing Clara. In this video we will discuss the possible causes for troubles with your stitches or for your sewing machine kind of eating your fabric, and I will also tell you what the solutions might be, because you don't always have to go ahead and have your machine repaired. Sometimes there are things you can do yourself very easily, and you should actually do yourself, and that can save you a lot of money long term. So let's jump right into this. Alright, so before we start looking into the solutions, I wanted to show you what messed up stitches may look like. There are various troubles that you can have in future. Hopefully you won't, but if that happens, don't worry. Even though this all looks like a lot of mess, there is a solution for everything, and even this huge knot where something I could solve myself, I did not have to have my sewing machine repaired. So I'm gonna zoom in a little bit so that you can see what it can look like. So I have here stitches that look kind of okay on one side, but there are all these little knots. And when I look at this stitch in the middle, it's not even really right, because I can easily pull the thread out and it wouldn't hold the fabric really in place. So that's obviously not correct. Then I have here a stitch that looks more like loops. That should have been straight stitch, but it's not. As you can see, I can pull it out. And here we have some knots. Then here, even though the stitches look kind of okay from the top, when I turn the fabric, you can see that they are 100% messed up. And then here, you see the zigzag. It looks super nice from the top, but when I turn it, you will notice that the zigzag no longer looks like nice clear V's. So there was obviously something wrong. And here I have another piece. The stitches were just not 100% correct, because I had here again some like super loose loops. And then I have here a piece of cloth that I use underneath my sewing foot when I'm storing my sewing machine, and these are just perfect. You can see here this zigzag. When I turn it, it's gonna look exactly the same, and you can see everything looks so neat, and that's exactly what you're going for. You have to be able to see perfect stitches from both sides. Messed up stitches is something pretty much anyone who is working with a sewing machine will have to deal with sooner or later. So it's nothing special. You don't have to worry about that. There are enough solutions for most of the problems. And it does not always mean that you have to have your machine repaired or replaced. Very often, if you know what the solutions are, it's gonna save you a lot of money long term, because you will be able to fix everything yourself. The first two things you always want to check are your sewing needle and your sewing foot. So there are different types of sewing feet, and there are different types of needles for each type of fabric. So there are fabrics that will require a little bit thicker needle. Some fabrics will require thinner and much pointier needle, and depending on whether you have a right needle or not, the needle will move correctly through the fabric, or it will have kind of a hard time going through the right way. So that's the first thing I like checking. Another thing about your needle can be that you might have been working with your needle for a long time, and needles get a little bit blunt over time. As they move downwards and up again, and as they touch the fabric, especially when you're sewing fast and especially when you're working with thicker and harder fabrics, the needle won't be the same after a while, and you will have to replace it. So sometimes you find out you have the correct type of needle and there should be nothing wrong with it, but it's simply a little bit blunt. You switch it and everything will work fine. Also, what can happen is sometimes that the needle gets bent a little bit when you come to a seam that's very thick, and the machine already makes a weird sound when you sew through the seam, and then the needle ends up being a little bit bent, and at some point the stitches won't be right. So always check the needle first, and also make sure you have the right type of a sewing foot. So usually whenever you set up your machine to a certain stitch, at least the computer operated machines will suggest what type of sewing foot you should use. So I have here a few examples of sewing needles. So these are, for example, for micro textile. They are super thin and super pointed. And I have here denim needles, stretch needles that are a bit thicker. They would be, for example, great for like stretchy denim fabric. And then I have here simply universal needles. And you can always ask when you're buying your fabric what needle the store that is selling you the fabric would recommend. You can also Google it, and usually there is somewhere in the manual for your sewing machine a list with at least a general idea what type of needle you should use for what type of fabric. Another troublemaker can be an incorrect tension for your thread. So I have here the wheel that sets the tension for the top thread on my sewing machine, and the standard is 4. So I can either lower it or increase it depending on the type of fabric I'm working with. If I'm honest, I'm usually having it set to the standard settings, and I should probably change it more often. Anyway, so when you get your sewing machine, it always comes with a manual, and somewhere in your manual will be a list that will tell you what tension do you need for what type of fabric. It's gonna be a list with some basic types of fabric, and that should help you out. If you can't find your manual, you can always Google that and play with the tension a little bit. And I find that the tension goes kind of hand in hand with the needle and the sewing foot, because these are really some basic things that can be changed very quickly. So definitely, if you're having troubles, and if you already checked your needle and your sewing foot, and if everything should be okay on the bottom part of your sewing machine, have a look at the tension for both the top thread and the bottom thread. So on my sewing machine, I have the wheel for the settings for the tension of the top thread here underneath the cover, and the wheel for the bottom thread is here in the back. That can be, of course, different depending on what sewing machine you are working with. Now, this solution is going to sound so basic, but it can make a huge difference. So each stitch can have certain settings when it comes to the width and the length, and sometimes it's just so easy. You only have to change the length or width of the stitches, and that will make a difference. So sometimes it's just as easy as that. So let's say you are sewing with a straight stitch, and I have here the standard settings 2.5, and the stitches would be kind of weird. Sometimes all you have to do is to increase the length of the stitches, and it will make a whole lot of difference. So definitely try that out too. Another not really technical solution can be the placement of your fabric. So especially if you are sewing stretchy fabrics, it will make a difference where you place your fabric. So the sewing foot has a little window where the needle goes through. And if you place especially stretchy fabric so that the needle will start going through at the very edge of your fabric, sometimes the machine will basically just eat the fabric, and the fabric will get caught here with these teeth. It will drive you insane, and it's just a very bad situation, because then you have to open everything here and gently remove the fabric from the bottom from these teeth. Make sure you never pull, never yank on anything that could cause some damage. Don't do that. So if that's the case, if you basically place your fabric so that it's very close, the edge is very close to the needle, sometimes a very simple solution, move it a little bit to the back. So when you lower your sewing foot, you are like, let's say, a quarter of an inch or maybe half an inch away from the edge, and then start sewing. And sometimes that's all that it requires. And again, if your machine still keeps eating the fabric, the cause might be that you would be working with an incorrect needle. So especially when you're working with stretchy fabric, make sure you are working with stretchy needle. Otherwise, you might have some problems, and the needle wouldn't be sharp and thin enough to go through the stretchy material, and it would kind of push the fabric inside your sewing machine, and that would cause the kind of eating of your fabric. Another possible sources of messed up stitches can be either dust, that can be dust from your thread or from your fabric caught somewhere here where you have the threading system, or underneath the sewing foot here below this cover where your bobbin is. So all that can cause some trouble. And if it's not dust, it can be possibly a little piece of thread that got ripped at some point and it got stuck, and it wouldn't be in the way at first, but as your newly threaded thread kept moving through the sewing machine, it might have pulled the piece of thread to a point where the machine then said, stop, I'm not gonna be working because the tension is not right, there is something wrong. So I have here this tiny piece of thread. I hope you can see it. And that thing got one day caught here on the top where the threading system is, and the machine was just not working right. And only after I removed this little chunk of thread, only then the machine started working properly again. And that was the entire solution. So again, it doesn't always have to be something disastrous. It can be only little things, but usually with especially computer operated sewing machines, they are very sensitive. Any little piece of dust or thread will cause trouble. So make sure you do regularly your maintenance. There's a video about how to do the basic maintenance and how to clean all this. So you can go ahead and watch it if you haven't watched it yet, and that will help you. So once you opened all these covers and cleaned everything out and made sure that there are no little chunks of thread, then it's possible that your sewing machine is going to be working right again. And last but not least, let me show you what can all get caught in your sewing machine when you don't do regular maintenance. I had my machine fixed and that's all they got out of my sewing machine. And back then, if I had been doing the sewing machine maintenance myself regularly, I could have saved all of this and I could have saved a lot of money. So definitely don't skip your sewing machine maintenance. If you haven't watched the video yet, please go ahead and watch it and do it at least every other time or every single time when you're working with fabrics that fray and that cause a lot of dust. Please do that. You're doing yourself a favor. So you see, sometimes it can be a very simple solution you can do yourself. You don't always have to have your sewing machine fixed. There are things you can easily do yourself and you can save yourself a lot of money long term, and you can fix your stitches in no time so that they are perfect again and so that your sewing machine will stop eating up your fabric. And one last advice for today. So whenever you are dealing with some troubles with your sewing machine, be it the stitches or the fact that your sewing machine is eating up the fabric, whatever that is, I highly recommend taking a short break first so that you can clear your mind and kind of take a step back. Maybe close your eyes if it helps, maybe even stand up and walk shortly around your house, drink a sip of water or have a coffee, whatever makes you feel better, and only then go back to your sewing machine and start looking for the possible causes and start fixing things. It really helps, and it's an advice that can be also applied in other areas in life, at least from my experience. So I hope that this video has been helpful. Thank you all so much for watching and happy sewing!